Get that ugly piece of junk off the roof before it destroys our property values. That was the last message HOA President Linda Mercer sent me before I left town for a 3-day emergency communications exercise. When I came home Sunday evening, my roof antenna was lying in twisted pieces across the front lawn. The coaxial cables had been cut. The metal mast was bent almost in half. 2 mounting brackets had been ripped straight through the shingles, leaving a dark opening above my radio room. Rainwater was already dripping through the ceiling. Taped to my front door was a $2,800 invoice for what Linda called an emergency removal. She had ordered a contractor onto my property, had them climb onto my roof, destroy my equipment, damage my house, and then send me the bill. Linda was standing across the street beside her white SUV, arms folded, watching me inspect the wreckage. Even from that distance, I could see the satisfied smile on her face. She thought she had finally taught me a lesson. What Linda didn't know was that the antenna wasn't an abandoned television relic or some homemade decoration I had bolted to the roof. It was part of a documented communications system. The specific rooftop equipment was covered by federal communications protections, and 6 weeks earlier, I had warned the HOA about those protections in writing. So I didn't yell. I didn't cross the street. I photographed every broken cable, backed up every second of security footage, and opened a new evidence folder on my computer. By the time the FCC complaint, insurance investigation, roof repairs, replacement equipment, and legal settlement were finished, Linda's HOA owed $75,000. But the money wasn't what ended her presidency. It was the voice recording made by one of the contractors standing on my roof. I parked in the driveway and sat behind the wheel for several seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. The antenna mast lay across the lawn like someone had snapped a metal tree in half. One section had crushed a flower bed my father planted more than 20 years earlier. The main feed line had been cut so close to the exterior wall that whoever did it clearly had no intention of allowing me to reconnect the system. Then I looked up. A jagged gap ran through the shingles above the room where I kept my radio and communications equipment. The workers had not carefully loosened the mounting hardware. They had torn it out with enough force to rip through the roofing membrane underneath. When I stepped inside, I found a brown water stain spreading across the ceiling. I had been gone for only 3 days. My next-door neighbor, Miguel Alvarez, walked over while I was photographing the damage. Miguel was a plumber who ran a small local business from a work van Linda had complained about several times. "You know about the crew?" he asked. I told him I didn't. He glanced toward Linda's house and lowered his voice. She was here the whole time. She told them the HOA had declared it an emergency. That word mattered. Under the association rules, a documented emergency could sometimes allow the board to act before completing the normal notice process. But there had to be an immediate and verifiable threat. My antenna had passed a professional roof inspection 6 months earlier. The mounting system was rated for winds well above local requirements, and Linda had received a copy of the inspection report. There had been no emergency. There had only been an opportunity. I removed the invoice from the front door. Brightview Property Services had charged $2,800 for hazardous equipment abatement. At the bottom, someone had written a note by hand. Bill homeowner directly if he refuses HOA reimbursement. That was Linda's style. Damage someone's property, describe it as enforcement, then send the victim the bill. I checked the doorbell camera first. At 9:08 Friday morning, a Brightview truck pulled up in front of my house. 3 men stepped onto the driveway. 2 carried ladders. The third carried a clipboard and kept looking across the street. At 9:14, Linda walked into view. She was wearing white pants, dark designer sunglasses, and the expression of someone supervising a landscaping project rather than an unauthorized entry onto another person's home. At 9:22, one of the workers pointed toward the antenna and asked her a question. The doorbell microphone didn't capture every word, but it caught enough. "Are you sure the owner approved this?" Linda opened the red HOA folder she always carried. "The association approved it." "That's not what I asked." Linda looked toward my empty driveway. "He's out of town. It's a safety hazard. We have emergency authority. Just remove everything." I replayed that sentence 3 times. Then I opened the file containing every installation record, engineering sheet, inspection report, delivery receipt, and email connected to the antenna. 6 weeks earlier, Linda had received written notice explaining that the rooftop equipment fell under federal communications rules and could not simply be prohibited or destroyed because the HOA disliked its appearance. The association could raise legitimate safety concerns. It could request reasonable documentation. It could propose a less visible location if that alternative still allowed the equipment to function properly. What it could not do was invent an emergency and physically destroy the system while I was away. Linda had not misunderstood the warning. She had waited until I left town, and when I watched the rest of the footage, I saw something that transformed a property dispute into a much larger problem. Linda climbed the ladder herself. Linda Mercer had decided what kind of man I was within a week of meeting me. To her, I was the quiet homeowner with the faded pickup truck, the work boots beside the garage door, and too many cables running through one room of an otherwise ordinary house. She saw the antenna and assumed I was an eccentric hobbyist who would surrender the moment the HOA sent an official-looking letter. She never asked what I did for a living. I had spent 32 years working in telecommunications. Early in my career, I maintained microwave relay equipment. Later, I helped design backup communication systems for hospitals, utility crews, and county agencies. After retiring, I volunteered as an emergency communications coordinator. When storms damaged cell towers, when networks became overloaded, or when rescue teams needed a reliable backup channel, volunteers like me helped keep information moving. The rooftop system Linda destroyed included a compact fixed wireless receiver protected under federal communications rules. It also supported the equipment I used during county emergency exercises. The system was practical, but it was personal too. My father introduced me to radio when I was 11 years old. He kept an old receiver on a wooden desk in the room that later became my communications station. On summer nights, we sat together listening to distant voices travel through waves of static. After he died, I bought the house from his estate instead of allowing it to leave the family. I repaired the roof, rewired the room, and installed the new equipment near the same place where his first homemade mast had stood. Linda knew none of that. What she knew was that I didn't attend her wine tastings. I didn't praise her landscaping newsletters, and I had refused to hide my pickup truck behind the house during one of her neighborhood real estate tours. At my first board meeting, she looked at my grease-stained jacket and asked whether I was operating a commercial business from my garage. No, I told her. I maintain communications equipment. She smiled as if I had confirmed something embarrassing. Well, we're trying to improve the character of the neighborhood. That was Linda's favorite kind of sentence. It sounded polite, but the meaning was always the same. People who looked like me were expected to obey people who looked like her. I had worked around damaged towers, failed generators, emergency rooms, and communication networks under pressure. A woman with a clipboard didn't frighten me. But I also knew better than to underestimate someone who believed a small title gave her permission to enter another person's property. So after reviewing the footage, I did not confront Linda. I called a roofing inspector, preserved the video in 3 separate locations, and sent one carefully worded email to every member of the HOA board. It contained only 3 sentences. I had not authorized anyone to enter my property. I had not authorized the removal of my equipment. And no one was to contact, alter, repair, move, or dispose of anything until my attorney had reviewed the evidence. Linda replied 9 minutes later. The board acted within its authority. That response told me she wasn't worried yet. She believed the red folder in her hand was stronger than every document in mine. By the following morning, I was about to discover how far she had gone to create that illusion. The dispute had started 3 months earlier, with a white envelope pushed beneath my front door. Across the top, in bold red letters, Linda had written, "Final notice of architectural violation." It was strange wording for a first notice. According to the letter, my antenna was an unauthorized rooftop structure that damaged neighborhood character, threatened property values, and created an unspecified safety risk. I read the entire document twice. It didn't identify a specific bylaw I had violated. It didn't include an engineering opinion. It didn't explain what danger the equipment supposedly presented. It simply ordered me to remove it within 10 days or face daily fines. I responded that afternoon. I sent the board the installation specifications, photographs of the mounting system, and the inspection report confirming that the mast had been professionally secured. I also included information about the federal rules covering the specific fixed wireless equipment installed on my property. Then I offered a compromise. I would repaint the visible brackets to match the roof, shorten one exposed cable run, and install a cleaner cover over the grounding connection. That should have ended the dispute. Instead, Linda appeared at my front door 2 days later with her red folder pressed against her chest. "I'm afraid cosmetic changes won't be enough," she said. "What exactly is the violation?" She looked up at the antenna, as if it had personally offended her. "It's visible from the street. So are the chimneys. That's different." "How?" She lowered her voice. "People buying in this neighborhood expect a certain appearance." That was when I noticed the photographer across the street. He was taking wide-angle photographs of Linda's house. Her property had not officially been listed, but she had already hired a real estate agent. The preliminary brochure described the street as a pristine luxury corridor with unobstructed architectural views. My roof appeared behind Linda's backyard in several of the photographs. Directly above her imported stone patio was the antenna she wanted removed. A week later, 2 more homeowners received violation notices. Miguel was ordered to move his work van because it looked commercial. A retired nurse named Carol Bennett was told to remove the wheelchair ramp she had installed for her sister because it disrupted the home's visual symmetry. Linda wasn't protecting community standards. She was staging the entire street for her own sale. I began requesting board records, meeting minutes, and copies of the rules she claimed to be enforcing. The first 2 requests were ignored. The third received a response from the association's management company. They could not find any board vote authorizing the antenna notice. When I forwarded that response to Linda, she answered within 4 minutes. "The board president has emergency discretion in matters affecting safety and property values." It was the first time she used the word emergency. It would not be the last. The clearest evidence of Linda's real motive arrived in an email she never intended me to receive. She sent it to the board, the property manager, and a real estate agent named Vanessa Cole. My address was included only because Susan Patel, the HOA treasurer, accidentally selected the full neighborhood mailing list. The subject line read, "Street presentation before listing photography." Linda had attached a checklist. Work vehicles were to be moved out of sight. Trash containers had to remain inside garages. Porch furniture was expected to match an approved color palette. Temporary accessibility structures were to be screened from the road. Beside my address, Linda had written, "Antenna must be removed before final exterior photos." There was no mention of safety, no structural concern, no emergency, only photographs. I saved the email before Linda recalled it 18 minutes later. By then, several neighbors had already read it. Carol called me first. "So my sister's wheelchair ramp is ruining Linda's listing photographs." Linda had told Carol that the ramp created an insurance hazard. Miguel had been told his van violated a new commercial vehicle rule. That rule didn't exist. Linda simply didn't want a plumbing company logo visible behind the photographer. The neighborhood was being dressed like a stage set so Linda could sell her house at a premium. Then I examined the attachment more carefully. At the bottom of the checklist was the name of the company scheduled to perform what Linda called appearance corrections. Brightview Property Services. The company belonged to Linda's brother-in-law, Mark Mercer. According to the financial records available to homeowners, Brightview had received 3 no-bid HOA contracts in 6 months. One was for landscaping. Another was for emergency tree removal after a storm that had never reached our county. The third was listed as exterior compliance services, authorization pending. The proposed budget was $12,500. I asked Susan whether the board had approved that contract. She replied privately, "No." Linda said she had presidential discretion. By then, the pattern was clear. Linda created violations. Her relative's company corrected them. The HOA paid the invoices, and homeowners who resisted were threatened with fines or liens. My antenna wasn't only interfering with the view from Linda's patio. It was another excuse to move association money through Brightview. I forwarded everything to my attorney, Melissa Grant. She called within an hour. "Daniel, don't confront her. Let her keep putting things in writing." That afternoon, Linda sent another notice. She claimed an unnamed expert had determined that my antenna presented an immediate risk of collapse. I requested the expert's name and a copy of the report. She refused. 2 days later, I left town for the county emergency exercise. Friday morning, while my driveway was empty, Brightview's truck arrived at my house. One of the workers, a young man named Jason Cole, was uncomfortable from the beginning. Before climbing the ladder, he activated the voice recorder on his phone. Brightview had sent him because he had basic roofing experience, but no one had told him he would be removing communications equipment from an occupied home. He started recording after Linda refused to show him a signed authorization from me. My doorbell footage showed Jason pointing toward the mounting brackets. "What about the cables?" he asked. "Cut them," Linda said. He hesitated. Linda tapped the red folder against her hand. "If you don't want the job, I'll find someone who does." The crew climbed onto the roof. Instead of disconnecting the feed line properly, they cut through it with bolt cutters. They removed 2 smaller brackets, but the main mounting plate had been sealed beneath the shingles. Jason warned Linda that forcing it loose could damage the roof. Her reply was captured clearly on his phone. "He'll pay for the repairs. Just get it down before the photographer comes Monday." That sentence destroyed every claim she would later make about public safety. The crew rocked the mast back and forth until the mounting plate tore through the shingles. When the antenna fell, one section struck the gutter before crashing into my father's flower bed. Linda applauded once. Then she climbed partway up the ladder and pointed toward the remaining grounding cable. "Remove all of it. I don't want him putting it back." By noon, the antenna was gone, the roof was open to the weather, and the crew had left without installing even a temporary waterproof cover. A storm passed through Saturday night. That was why water had already reached my ceiling before I returned home. On Monday morning, the roofing inspector photographed the torn membrane, checked the attic, and measured moisture spreading through the insulation. "This wasn't a removal," he said. "They peeled part of your roof open." His preliminary estimate exceeded $18,000. Before he left, he asked who had authorized the work. I showed him Linda's email claiming emergency authority. He read it once and handed my phone back. "Then ask her for the engineering report that declared the emergency." I already had. Linda had refused to provide it. That afternoon, Jason called me privately. "I recorded what she told us," he said, "and there's something else you need to know." Linda had not merely claimed that the board approved the job. She had shown the crew a document bearing my signature. Jason sent me a photograph of it. At the top was the HOA logo. Beneath it, a paragraph claimed that I had voluntarily authorized Brightview to enter my property and remove the rooftop equipment. At the bottom was my name. Beside it was a signature that looked almost, but not quite, like mine. Whoever created the form had copied the signature from my original architectural application. They reproduced the long first stroke and the sharp angle in my last name, but missed one detail. For more than 20 years, I had placed a small dot beneath the final letter whenever I signed a legal document. My father had done the same thing, and I had kept the habit without thinking about it. The signature on Linda's form had no dot. I forwarded the image to Melissa. She called immediately. "Don't accuse anyone yet. Preserve the original. We need to determine where it came from, who created it, and who delivered it to the contractor." That was when my evidence folder became a full timeline. I created a separate entry for every event. The first violation notice. My engineering response. Linda's refusal to identify her supposed safety expert. The email about the real estate photography. The Brightview contracts. The security footage. Jason's recording. The false authorization. The roofing report. The moisture damage inside the attic. I also contacted the equipment supplier and requested replacement estimates. The antenna itself was only one part of the system. The workers had damaged the mast, grounding assembly, feed line, surge protection unit, fixed wireless receiver, and weatherproof entry panel connected to the exterior wall. Restoring everything would require specialized labor and system recertification. By Tuesday afternoon, the documented property damage had passed $40,000. Linda continued acting as if the matter involved nothing more than an unpaid HOA fine. She sent another message demanding that I pay the $2,800 removal invoice within 10 days. She also warned that reinstalling the equipment would result in a lien against my home. I didn't respond directly. Melissa sent the board a formal preservation notice instructing them not to delete emails, alter meeting minutes, destroy invoices, or communicate privately about the removal. Within 2 hours, Susan Patel called me. Her voice shook. "Daniel, there was never a vote." "Linda told us you signed the authorization." "I didn't." There was a long silence. Then Susan said something that made the case even worse. The document Linda showed the board wasn't the same document she gave the contractor. Two different authorizations existed. Both carried my name. Neither had been signed by me. Susan sent both documents to Melissa that evening. The version shown to the board described the work as a voluntary aesthetic modification. It claimed I had agreed to remove the antenna in exchange for partial reimbursement from the HOA. The version given to Brightview described the antenna as an immediate structural hazard. It authorized emergency entry without the homeowner present. Same property. Same supposed signature. Two completely different stories. The document metadata showed that both files had been created on Linda's personal laptop less than 24 hours before I left town. Then Susan found the email that connected everything. 6 weeks earlier, after I sent the board the technical specifications and federal guidance, Linda forwarded my message to Susan and 2 other board members. Her response contained 4 sentences. "He's trying to intimidate us with federal language. The HOA controls exterior appearance. He'll give up once the equipment is gone. Remove it while he's gone." Melissa sent the email, the 2 authorizations, Jason's recording, and the security footage to the HOA's insurance carrier. The insurer reacted faster than Linda did. By Thursday morning, the board received a reservation of rights letter. The insurer had not yet denied coverage, but it warned that the policy might exclude deliberate property damage, fraudulent documents, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and actions taken for personal financial benefit. That meant the HOA could be forced to pay a large part of the claim from its reserve funds. It also meant individual board members could face personal exposure if they continued protecting Linda after learning what she had done. For the first time, Linda's authority began to crack. 2 members resigned from the architectural committee. Susan requested an emergency board meeting. The property management company suspended every enforcement action involving my home. Linda responded by doubling down. She emailed the entire neighborhood and announced that I was threatening the HOA with a frivolous federal lawsuit because the board had removed a dangerous structure. She claimed the county had approved the demolition. That was a mistake. Melissa contacted the county building office and requested every inspection, complaint, and authorization associated with my address. The county's response arrived the next morning. No inspector had visited my property. No structural emergency had been reported. No demolition had been approved. And the official Linda claimed had authorized the work was prepared to attend the next HOA meeting and say so publicly. Linda scheduled the meeting believing she could control the room. She didn't know that Jason, the county inspector, an insurance representative, and my attorney would all be sitting in the audience. The community room was full 20 minutes before the meeting began. Linda sat behind the board table with her red folder open in front of her. She had invited the neighborhood because she believed a public audience would strengthen her position. She wanted everyone to watch her put me back in my place. Melissa and I sat in the final row. Jason took a chair near the side wall. Susan sat at the board table but avoided looking at Linda. Robert Hale, the county building inspector, stood quietly beside the entrance. Linda either didn't recognize him or assumed he was another resident. She called the meeting to order and immediately moved my property dispute to the first agenda item. The board was forced to remove a dangerous and unauthorized structure, she announced. Mr. Reeves repeatedly ignored safety notices and left us no alternative. Melissa leaned toward me. Let her finish. So I said nothing. Linda claimed an independent expert had warned that the antenna could collapse in high winds. She claimed the county had approved emergency removal. She claimed I initially agreed to the work and then changed my story after receiving the bill. Every statement entered the official meeting record. Then she held up the authorization bearing my copied signature. We have written consent. Several residents turned toward me. Linda smiled. That was the moment she believed she had won. Melissa stood. Would you identify the independent expert who inspected Mr. Reeves's antenna? Linda's expression tightened. The report is confidential. Did the expert visit the property? The board received professional guidance. From whom? Linda tapped the folder. I'm not going to debate privileged safety information. Melissa nodded. Then let's discuss the county approval. She turned toward the entrance. Mr. Hale? The inspector stepped forward. The room became silent. "My office issued no approval," he said. "We received no emergency complaint, performed no inspection, and authorized no entry onto this property." Linda stared at him. "That's not what I was told." "By whom?" She didn't answer. Melissa displayed copies of the two authorization forms on the projector. One described a voluntary aesthetic modification. The other claimed an immediate structural emergency. Both carried different language. Both carried my name. Both had been created on Linda's computer. Susan spoke next. "The board never voted to enter Daniel's property." Linda turned toward her. "You approved the emergency action." "No," Susan said. "You told us Daniel had already signed." A murmur spread through the room. Linda raised her voice. "This is becoming a coordinated attack on the association." That was when Jason stood. "No, ma'am. This is about what you told us on his roof." He placed his phone beside the meeting microphone and pressed play. Linda's recorded voice filled the room. "He'll pay for the repairs. Just get it down before the photographer comes Monday." No one moved. Then the recording continued. "I don't want him putting it back." Linda reached toward the phone. Melissa stepped between them. "Don't touch the evidence." For the first time since I had known her, Linda had nothing to say. But Melissa had not yet shown the most expensive document in her briefcase. She removed a thick blue folder and placed it beneath the projector. "Mrs. Mercer, you have repeatedly described this as an ordinary architectural dispute. It isn't." The first page was the federal communications complaint filed on my behalf. Behind it were the antenna specifications, installation photographs, engineering certification, every warning I sent the board, and the federal guidance Linda had dismissed as a bluff. Melissa explained that an HOA could raise legitimate safety concerns and request reasonable documentation. What it could not do was invent an emergency, forge the homeowner's consent, trespass onto private property, and destroy covered communications equipment because the board president disliked how it appeared in real estate photographs. Linda folded her arms. This equipment was still prohibited by our architectural rules. Melissa changed the image on the projector. Linda's own email appeared on the screen. "He'll give up once the equipment is gone. Remove it while he's gone. Federal protections are not optional because an HOA president prefers a cleaner skyline," Melissa said. Then she displayed the damages summary. The room went silent again. Replacing the receiver, antenna, mast, grounding hardware, surge protection, exterior feed panel, cabling, and specialized installation was estimated at $18,500. Repairing the torn shingles, damaged membrane, wet insulation, ceiling, and interior paint would cost another $21,000. Technical inspections, moisture testing, and system recertification added $7,500. Legal work, temporary equipment, federal filing expenses, and other losses brought the settlement demand to $75,000. A homeowner near the front whispered, "$75,000?" Melissa looked directly at the board. "That is the current demand. It may increase if this continues." Linda laughed, but the sound was thin. "The HOA's insurance will handle it." A man sitting near Jason stood and introduced himself as counsel for the insurance carrier. "We have not agreed to cover Mrs. Mercer's conduct." Linda's face changed. He explained that the policy covered certain negligent board decisions. It did not necessarily cover deliberate trespass, forged documents, self-dealing, or intentional destruction of private property. If the investigation confirms these actions were undertaken for personal benefit, the association may be responsible for the loss, and the insurer may seek recovery from the individuals involved. Now every homeowner understood what Linda had risked. Their reserve fund, their monthly dues, their property values, all to improve the photographs of her own house. Linda looked down at the red folder, but it no longer resembled authority. It looked like evidence. Then Jason's attorney stepped forward. "My client is prepared to identify who created the false authorization and who instructed the crew to misrepresent the invoice." Linda stood suddenly. "This meeting is adjourned." Susan reached for the microphone. "No, the board is voting on that." For the first time, Linda no longer controlled the room. A side door opened. Mark Mercer, the owner of Brightview and Linda's brother-in-law, entered with his attorney. He looked nothing like the confident contractor who had billed me for destroying my own equipment. His attorney placed a packet of invoices and text messages on the board table. Mark admitted that Linda had promised Brightview additional HOA contracts if he removed the antenna before her listing photographs were taken. She told him the board approved the work. She told him I had signed a release. Neither statement was true. Melissa displayed a text Linda sent Mark the night before the demolition. Use the emergency invoice. The HOA can pay you first, then charge Daniel. That message explained everything. Linda intended to use association money to pay her relative, place the expense on my account, and improve the view from the house she planned to sell. Mark also admitted that the $2,800 removal charge had been inflated. The workers were supposed to receive less than half of it. The rest was categorized as an administrative emergency fee. Susan opened the HOA bank records. Brightview had already received a $4,000 advance from the reserve fund. The room erupted. Homeowners demanded Linda's resignation. Others wanted to know whether previous emergency contracts had been manufactured the same way. Linda tried to blame Mark. He shook his head. You sent the forms, you gave the order, and you told me he was too cheap to hire a lawyer. That sentence landed harder than everything else. Linda had not only underestimated federal law, she had underestimated me. Susan called for an immediate vote to suspend Linda's authority and revoke her access to HOA accounts and records. The motion passed unanimously. Linda gathered her red folder and started toward the exit. Before she reached the door, the insurance attorney stopped her. Mrs. Mercer, do not remove or destroy any association documents. She placed the folder back on the table. For the first time, Linda walked out of an HOA meeting with nothing in her hands. The settlement negotiations lasted 6 weeks. After the insurer reviewed Linda's emails, the false authorizations, Jason's recording, the security footage, and the financial connection to Brightview, no one continued arguing that the removal had been an innocent mistake. The only question was who would pay. The final agreement totaled $75,000. $18,500 covered the replacement communications equipment and specialized installation. $21,000 paid for the roof, attic insulation, ceiling repairs, interior damage, and water remediation. $7,500 covered technical inspections, moisture testing, and recertification. The remaining $28,000 covered legal fees, temporary equipment, federal filing expenses, and the disruption caused by the unauthorized demolition. The insurer paid part of the settlement, but reserved the right to recover money connected to Linda's intentional conduct. The HOA also demanded repayment of Brightview's $4,000 advance. Linda resigned before the board could formally remove her. Her house was taken off the market, and her real estate agent terminated their contract after learning why the entire street had been subjected to those appearance corrections. The settlement check was delivered to Melissa's office. When she handed it to me, she asked whether I felt vindicated. I looked through the window at the temporary tarp still covering part of my roof. Not yet. The money could replace the equipment. It could repair the damage, but it could not guarantee that the next person holding a clipboard would understand where HOA authority ended. Before installing the replacement antenna, I asked the neighborhood for one final vote. 2 weeks later, the homeowners approved a new enforcement policy. No board member could enter private property without written consent, a court order, or a verified emergency involving immediate danger. Every contractor relationship had to be disclosed. Homeowners received a formal appeal period before enforcement action. And any future dispute involving communications equipment required review by independent counsel, rather than the personal opinion of whoever held the HOA president's title. The reforms passed without opposition. By early fall, the roof had been repaired and the replacement system was ready. The new antenna stood on reinforced mounting hardware, with cleaner cabling, and a complete engineering file stored with the county emergency office. Linda had called the old one an eyesore. The replacement was stronger. 3 months later, a severe windstorm crossed the county. Trees fell across power lines. Cellular service became unreliable. Most of the neighborhood lost electricity before midnight. I powered the radio room from the backup battery system and checked into the county emergency network. Within minutes, I was relaying road closures, medical requests, and welfare checks between local volunteers and the Emergency Operations Center. Miguel came to my door carrying a flashlight. An elderly resident at the end of the street depended on supplemental oxygen, and her family couldn't complete a phone call. I transmitted the request. A response team reached her home 12 minutes later. By sunrise, Several neighbors were standing in my garage, listening as information moved through the equipment Linda had tried to destroy. No one called it ugly. After the storm, the new board established a small emergency preparedness committee. We installed backup charging stations in the clubhouse and organized annual communications drills for residents. I never wanted revenge against the neighborhood. I wanted the people controlling it to understand something simple. A title does not give you ownership of someone else's home. A clipboard does not outrank federal law. And a quiet homeowner who keeps records is not powerless. Sometimes, he is simply waiting for you to finish creating the evidence. Linda's attempt to improve her property value cost the HOA $75,000. But the most expensive lesson was the one she never expected. The antenna she tore from my roof became the system her former neighbors depended on when everything else went silent. What would you have done if an HOA president destroyed federally protected equipment on your own roof? Would you have confronted her immediately, or stayed quiet and built the evidence file? Share your answer in the comments. And if you believe real documents should always defeat fake authority, subscribe for more stories where HOA Karens finally learn that someone else's property is not theirs to control.